Welcome into In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you as always. Happy Wednesday. And if you can't tell, I am once again recording at least this portion of the show in the evening hours. And you know what that means. And many of you probably already know what I'm about to say based on if you click this whenever it first released or not. And that is, it's the second show in a row that I was able to release early in the morning. You know, sometimes things work out like that, sometimes they don't. But for those of you who like the early shows, if you're early risers, then you're getting more of what you want this week. You may even get this 3 times. I don't know how things are going to work out towards the end of the week, but we may end up having 3 straight shows that release pretty early in the morning. So if that's your cup of tea or cup of coffee, whatever it is, then I'm glad to please you. As you all know, that's not usually how things work out. It just happens to be how things are working out this week. So it is Wednesday. It is the middle of the week. It is the opening day for the Big Ten tournament. It's also the opening day for, I believe, the SEC tournament. Many of the other conference tournaments have already gotten things underway, and several of the smaller, mid-major, low-major conferences, they've already wrapped up some things. And, sometimes that involves some bid stealing, which may or may not affect Indiana. Thankfully, if Indiana does enough in the Big Ten tournament, which at this point, I believe just defeating Oregon on Thursday will likely be more than enough to solidify Indiana's spot in the NCAA tournament, even with a few bid stealers, however many that may be. And I don't even think power conferences are, exempt from this. And specifically, when you look at the ACC, there's currently only 3 projected teams from the Atlantic Coast Conference to get in, that being Duke, Louisville, and Clemson. Well, we all know what happened last year. You've heard me mention it a million times. NC State went on a magical run that not only got them into the big dance via the ACC tournament, but it got them all the way to the Final Four. So if somebody, from that league gets hot, that could be a 4th team from the ACC that wouldn't have gotten in to the NCAA tournament. So that's something that, maybe you don't expect to happen, but it could. It could knock out an Ohio State. It could knock out, a Texas, an Arkansas, whoever it may be. So if you're Indiana or if you're any of those teams that are on the bubble, you better be hoping for, a really good showing in your conference tournament, or at least a good enough showing in order to get yourself off of that last 4 line. Because, so if there's up to 4 bid stealers, I don't know really what the average is for the NCAA tournament, but if there's that many, then that's the entire last 4 in getting knocked out, and it becomes a completely new batch of teams. So, like, even if you're Indiana right now, if you're comfortably in the last 4 buys where you don't have to play in Dayton, you get enough of those bid stealers, you find yourself, back in the first 4 place, or you maybe don't expect Indiana to be. But as we all know, this is March Madness, and the madness will ensue whether we like it or not. I think we like it for the most part, just not when it affects the team that we root for, right? Isn't that how things work? But a quick look at today's action around the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Tipping things off at 3:30, you've got the Northwestern Wildcats taking on the Minnesota Golden Gophers. After that at 6 o'clock, approximately 6 o'clock. You never know, given games that go to overtime or, just last a little bit longer than they should. But game number 2, you got the Iowa Hawkeyes and the Ohio State Buckeyes. That very well could be an elimination game for Ohio State. I think if the Buckeyes don't win, I'd say at least a couple of games. Definitely if they lose to Iowa today, then their hopes and dreams of making the NCAA tournament are probably in the dust. But we all know what happened last year. Ohio State was kind of one of those teams that got in on a magical run. I don't think they won the Big Ten tournament. I don't want to, if I'm wrong about that, then feel free to correct me. But I do remember this kind of being a coming out party for, now permanent head coach Jake Diebler, who was, kind of making a name for himself after Chris Holtmann had already been let go midway through the year and ended up kind of solidifying the job for himself when it was all said and done. And by the way, if you all were following along with the head coaching searches last year, you know that John Calipari nearly took the Ohio State job. I can't remember if Jake Diebler had already done enough to kind of let them say, okay, we'll just retain him, or if Calipari had just decided, you know what it was? Calipari was ready to make a run with Kentucky, or thought he would make a deep run. Of course, they ended up losing to Oakland. And so the door shut before it was able to really, kind of, before the job was done, so to speak. And I promise I'm not making that up. If you think I am, go look into it. That's kind of how things worked out for John Calipari. That's why he's at Arkansas and not Ohio State. He wanted to get out of Kentucky. And I mean, it's clearly, you saw the way things played out last year. Kentucky didn't let John Calipari go. He had one of the most comfy contracts in college basketball, and he stepped away because it was a loveless marriage. And even though he did wonderful things for them at different portions during his career there, it was still something that had just kind of run its course in Lexington. But either way, I just kind of stun locked myself right there for a couple of minutes. But yeah, Iowa and Ohio State in game 2, more than likely something that, not even more than likely, it is most certainly a must-win game for Ohio State if they are going to survive and potentially make the NCAA tournament. And then the nightcap on Wednesday, you've got USC and Rutgers. Really, when it comes to the opening weekend of the opening day of the Big Ten tournament, I should say, not a lot, expected out of any of those teams. But at the same time, you never know who may. Really, the only team out of that who has a really actual genuine postseason aspirations is Ohio State. And so taking a look at the bracket right now, Northwestern and Minnesota, the winner will go on to face Wisconsin on Thursday. The winner of Iowa and Ohio State will move on to face Illinois. And then USC and Rutgers will go on to face Purdue in the Thursday matchups. So, and then the double buys for those who have not, because we haven't really done much Big Ten tournament talk other than just kind of big picture stuff regarding Indiana. But the teams of the double buys, Michigan State, the number 1, Indiana and Oregon will move on to face them. The winner of that game, I should say. And then UCLA will await, they're the 4 seed. UCLA will await either Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Northwestern. Maryland will wait on either Illinois, Ohio State, or Iowa, and then Michigan will await either Purdue, Rutgers, or USC to round out your 2025 Big Ten men's basketball tournament. So, and by the way, if you want to watch any of today's action, I should say, you got to watch it on Peacock, the cock, as some people refer to it as. I like to. Sometimes I feel a little dirty saying it like that, but that's neither here nor there. Zach Osterman from the Indy Star is going to join the show once again today here in just a few moments. Kind of preview sort of more of the Big Ten tournament for Indiana and kind of think realistically what should fans be expecting from their NCAA tournament chances. Could they make a run with the couple of games that are ahead of them in this tournament? And then towards the very end, we talk a little bit about some just the head coaching updates. I kind of bring up the Jeff Goodman nonsense that ensued a couple of days ago, and what should fans really be looking at right now when it comes to the Indiana coaching search, and what's what to kind of believe in, what not to believe in, what's really focused on, what's real, what's not. We don't get like too thick into the weeds because it's fairly simple when you really think about it, what's more than likely going to happen. And I'll let him share that with you later on during the show. And then maybe afterward on the other side, we'll get into, maybe more of my commentary on what he said. So I guess with that being said, we'll go ahead and transition into that segment, because now that I've already mentioned that the only Zach Osterman is going to be on the show, you don't want to hear me blabber anymore. Some of you may have even clicked on the show and saw that Zach Osterman was going to be a guest when you clicked on the the YouTube link and thought, okay, I want to hear Zach. We don't need to hear from Mr. John Alden. We hear from him all the time. Or maybe you're somebody who doesn't listen to the show in general unless it's a guest that that you like to hear from. And if that's the case, then, good for you as well. But I guess I'll just shut my yapper and we'll get rolling here. So we'll continue right now our conversation with Mr. Zach Osterman about the Big Ten tournament and the Indiana Hoosiers, as well as the ongoing men's basketball coaching search. Joining me once again from the Indy Star, it is my pleasure to welcome Zach Osterman once again to In Touch with Indiana Sports. Glad to have you on board once again.
Hey, thanks for having me as always.
We'll go ahead and dive right in. Of course, we'll talk a lot of Indiana basketball matters today. What do you make of just kind of the momentum? I believe last time we talked, it was kind of on the cusp of everything really shifting from, we were talking really coaching candidates, I feel like, for the most part. But this particular Indiana team has really found a lot of momentum over the last several weeks. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it would be too far on my monitor. The reason I'm looking over the cameras, I'm pulling up to just kind of remind myself the sequence of games. I think it would go too far to sort of quote unquote give this team credit for sort of turning things around, because I do think that in the grand scheme of this season, that Illinois game on January 14th probably was a bit of a line in the sand for this team. They've only lost one game by double figures since then. Now, number one, that game was kind of ugly up at Wisconsin, but you're allowed to lose by 12 at Wisconsin. Yes, there were also, they were down 18 at home to Michigan. They were down 13 at home to UCLA. But on the other hand, they led, almost throughout that second half against Michigan State. They led almost throughout against Purdue. Like, you can start to nitpick basically and say, well, you can start to cherry pick that this is good, but this isn't good. The point is they have been a significantly better team in the last, I would argue, 13 games than they were in the first 18. And I think there are a few things that have gone into that. But, in the first 18 games, they lose 5 of them, each by at least 16 points, 3 of those 5 by 25 or more. In the last 13 games, they've only lost 1 game by double figures. On the other hand, they are 6-7 in those games. So you give them some credit, I think, for maybe Mike Woodson figuring out certain lineup adjustments that needed made. Obviously, Indiana is kind of forced to try some of the too big stuff without Malik Renew, but it's still, it's still something that Indiana kind of persists with, especially down the stretch here. Renew's been playing off the bench a lot lately. I think the guard play's improved. The 3-point shooting's improved. Players like Luke Goody and Anthony Leal have, I think, really kind of, been spiritual and emotional leaders for this team. But again, we're talking about a stretch that the reason I say you don't really give them too much credit is we're talking about a stretch in which they went 6-7, and even turning around, maybe finding a way to win one of Michigan or UCLA games that Indiana very much battled back in, and then just closing out the Maryland game at home lends this season a completely different tenor. They're comfortably in the tournament. They're probably like an 8 seed, maybe even pushing a 7. And we're talking about, oh wow, they won 12 games in the Big Ten. They beat, maybe you turn around that game at Purdue. They swept Purdue. Look at you get a lot more credit suddenly for some of the road wins and for, being perfect against quads 2 through 4. What I'm trying to say is I didn't think this team had in it what it has proven capable of in the last month.
Okay.
On January 14th. And I think that is to Indiana's credit. But in the same breath, since January 14th, Indiana is 6-7. So let's, so I don't want anyone to take it as I think this has been some grand turnaround. They have still been the architect of too many of their own problems. to be anywhere better than on the bubble going into the Big Ten tournament.
It's also a matter of when you look at preseason expectations, everyone had them slotted pretty much at 1 or number 2. And I think that's where a lot of the high level of impatience came from throughout the season, because this is not a terrible year by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not up to the Indiana standard, and the standards more so specifically for this season going into it. And that's why things probably really ended the way that they did with Mike Woodson. And thankfully, things are he's still kind of gracefully moving on, especially depending on how the rest of this postseason goes. That'll all get started on Thursday. But I do think a lot of it is when you go back to the beginning, preseason expectations really set the tone for how people were going to judge this team from the very beginning.
And I mean, I think it's preseason expectations compared to, and the number shifts a little bit depending on who you talk to, but compared to having, if not the highest single NIL, sort of, roster number, however you want to phrase that, the Big Ten, then certainly one of the top 2 or 3. And I'm pretty confident in saying probably no worse than top 15 nationally. I would bet top 10, maybe even pushing top 5, all inclusive. Listen, the manager of the Yankees gets less grace than the manager of the Pirates. And I'm not trying to, if our good friend Dustin DePerac is watching, he probably just let out a sad moan. But, when you're working with top level resources, those expectations are more fair. And, I think there's, on our podcast yesterday, I talked about how really it's kind of felt like 3 of Mike Woodson's 4 seasons have kind of followed this pattern where, you go back to last year, obviously Indiana goes through a stretch there where it goes from 12-5 and 4-2 in the Big Ten to 14-13 and 6-10 in the Big Ten before winning 4 straight to end the regular season. The results didn't quite match it, but if people can kind of rewind their minds back to his first season, Indiana was 16-5 when they beat Maryland. They were 7-4, and then they lost 5 straight, and they looked pretty bad for the first 3 of those 5. And then Woodson kind of shifted toward letting Xavier Johnson and Trace Jackson Davis run their ball screen offense just a little bit more independently. And they go 2-4 down the stretch, but they looked a lot better. They lost a just kind of a high-level game at home against Wisconsin where Johnny Davis went off. They should have beaten Ohio State and Columbus. They beat Maryland and Minnesota, and then they lose by a combined 5 points to Rutgers at home and Purdue on the road. But in each of these seasons, we find ourselves at some point in the season saying, why couldn't Indiana figure this out sooner? And when you start talking about this team and this season, that argument gets framed even more starkly through the lens of Mike Woodson had a ton of roster space after last season ended. He had a very healthy, I don't want to say limitless because it's not, but very healthy NIL number to work with. Basically what I'm trying to get at here is Mike Woodson had the ability to build this team in whatever image he wanted. Yeah. And he chose with his staff, with his scouting, whatever, to go target the players that he did. And, the team that he came up with the exception of Luke Goody and Miles Rice and Umar Ballo, Cannon Carlisle has really been kind of relegated here. Rice is, I think, playing more than people think, but he's only started 1 of Indiana's last 7 games. So another, the roster Mike Woodson chose to build ran into the same sort of mid-season, almost kind of crisis that the previous 2 of the previous 3 teams that he had in Indiana did too. And, it's not unfair to say, yeah, you get credit for being better in your, let's say, your second 10 Big Ten games compared to your first 10 Big Ten games. And you get credit for winning 5 of 7 at the end of the season But number one, you went 5, and if you split that conference record down the middle, you went 5-5 in the first 10 and the second 10. So even if you're playing better basketball, the results are not dramatically different. Number two, it's yet another year where it feels like Indiana is not well constructed initially and then takes too long to reach whatever is its best version of itself long term. And that's where I say, like, I think you can at once allow for or recognize the fact that this team is playing better basketball in the last month than it was before, last maybe month and a half, while still also acknowledging that what got it here just isn't good enough.
And then now you look at Thursday, they'll face Oregon again. If you look at the last few games, their only loss of the last little bunch. But it's a game where there was a lot of fouling issues, a lot of Mike Woodson being angry about the calls and that sort of thing. It does feel like it sets up for a perfect revenge type of matchup. And plus, if you look at bracketologies right now, it also depends on who you look at. Some people don't necessarily think Indiana should be as comfortably thinking them being in the NCAA tournament as maybe one might assume. I think going into this initially a couple of days ago, people thought Indiana may have already punched their ticket to the NCAA tournament. I think if they happen to lose to Oregon, I don't want to say they'd for sure be out, but they're definitely going to have to sweat a little more on Selection Sunday.
Yeah, I don't think they'll be in as bad of shape, as they were. If you think back to 3 years ago, we thought Indiana needed at least one win in the Big Ten tournament. They got 2, and everybody said they're comfortably in. There's nothing to worry about. And then it actually turned out on Selection Sunday, basically, if they hadn't beaten Illinois, they probably would have been out of the field. So you don't want to lend too much weight to what happens in a conference tournament. That the committee has made that clear. I think Indiana is in probably a significantly more comfortable position on the bubble this year than it was 3 years ago for a variety of reasons. Now, the flip side to that is this is the week when bid thieves tend to come up. I think the only league that might have really threatened that in the first round of conference tournaments was the Valley. Ben McCollum and Drake kind of hold up the British end and clinch the auto bid there. But this is the week when you've got the Mountain West, the A10. It seems unlikely.
Even the ACC. I mean, the ACC is probably going to get like 3 teams in.
And I was going to throw the Big East in there. It seems unlikely, but you never know. The Big West quietly. San Diego probably should. Just about be in the tournament. They've only got one KenPom top 100 win outside of conference play, but they're 28-4. And that win was at Utah State, which is itself another at-large candidate. So the point is, like, this is the week where bid thieves can become a problem, and you can go from, kind of comfortably in the tournament to boom, suddenly you're not anymore, especially if you lose and you have to spend the whole weekend watching everybody else play and hoping that, nobody pops up and makes trouble for you. I do think Indiana's in a position where one win probably seals it. And in fact, I suspect one win even gets them out of Dayton, because there are some elements of Indiana's resume that are very appealing. The non-conference strength of schedule is not an issue nearly the way it was 3 years ago. This year, Indiana's non-conference strength of schedule per KenPom is 131. By comparison, 3 years ago it was 319. Like, that was Indiana was, I forget exactly what the number was, but like Indiana was like historically bad in non-conference strength of schedule for an at-large. It was like the, far and away the outlier historically for non-conference strength of schedule, lack of non-conference wins for an at-large team. Indiana's got some good road wins, which most bubble teams don't have. It's got, the only team that beat Michigan State at Michigan State this season, plus a win against a fellow bubble team in Ohio State on the road, and then a couple more road wins that count as quad ones, even if, like a Penn State, for example, it's a quad one, even if Penn State's not in the field. And then the last thing Indiana has that does matter, it does make a difference, is Indiana's absolutely perfect against 2, 3, and 4. And that's likely to stay that way because it's unlikely Indiana's going to play a quad 2 opponent in Indianapolis. And if they do, it will be in the late rounds of the tournament against somebody that made a run. And so you probably would have picked up quad 1 wins that would counter picking up one quad 2 loss. I predicted Indiana to win this game. I thought the game was incredibly even out in Oregon. I thought a lot of I think Oregon's a tough matchup for Indiana. I think Jackson Shellstad's just one of those players that no matter how well you guard him, sometimes he just scores. I think we saw that with that deep three he made at Oregon. Or out in Eugene, I think Oregon's got some size, some length, some athleticism in depth that it can throw at a team like Indiana that most teams can't, that disrupts some of what Indiana wants to do with the way it uses its guards now versus its bigs. But, I think Indiana would say all we got to do is hit 3 of the 23 twos we missed, and that game is completely different down the stretch. And I also think a lot of the sort of matchup functions of that game favored Oregon. Indiana was at the end of a West Coast trip. Oregon was at home. I don't think the officiating was necessarily unfair so much as I think the officiating just allowed the game to be played in a way that Oregon preferred or that favored Oregon compared to Indiana, especially in Eugene. And now so much of that is flipped. Indiana's going to have the crowd. Indiana's going to have, the home cooking, so to speak. I don't know if any of these Oregon players have even played in this building before. If they have, there can't be many of them. Oregon I looked this up, they're 2-2 in the first leg of trips east in Big Ten play this year. And one of those 2 wins was by 2 points at Iowa. So it's a bad Iowa team. So the point is Oregon's struggled, at least in a small sample size that we have. Oregon has struggled to, I think, really sort of manage kind of the early impact of the time change when it's come east this season, which isn't surprising. And this game is going to be an extreme version of that because this game is
being at noon or 9 a.m. local time for them.
Right. And I've made this, I've used this example a couple times this week when I've been talking to people. I grew up a Falcons fan when the Falcons played in the NFC West. And even when the Niners were good and the Falcons were bad, the Falcons tended to give San Francisco trouble in Atlanta because coming west to east for a 12:31 o'clock kickoff was very difficult for the body clock. And if you are, the other thing is, and you don't want to get into just who wants it more, that's not quantifiable. Yeah. But if you're Dana Altman, do you pull out? Your team is 23-8. You're comfortably in the field. Do you pull out all the stops for what is likely to be an incredibly taxing Big Ten tournament run? Or do you just say, hey, listen, our focus is on the big tournament. Our focus is on, the one that comes starting next week. What I'm saying is, did Dana Altman throw his team on a plane on Sunday night and say, we're going to get to Indianapolis as quickly as possible. We're going to adjust to the time change. We're going to shoot in the arena. We're going to do all this stuff. Or if you're Dana Altman, is there not maybe more value for you to just say, we'll take whatever we can get out of Indianapolis, but we don't need anything. And on the flip side, it's not the worst thing in the world if, we go out there, we lose, we come home, we rest, we see where we're going, and we really kind of go again and sturdy ourselves for the big tournament in 2 weeks. I just think a lot of in what already looked like a pretty even matchup between these two programs, a week ago in Eugene, it seems to me that a lot of the matchup sort of all credit to Oregon. They've won 7 in a row. They're a good team. They deserve it. And if they beat Indiana, I won't be shocked. But a lot of the matchup advantages that favored Oregon last week, I think favor Indiana this week. And I think Indiana will win the game.
Before I let you go, Zach, I do want to ask you a little about the ongoing Indiana basketball head coaching search. And I know Jeff Goodman put out some stuff the other day that, people kind of clowned him for and that sort of stuff. I'm not necessarily asking you to comment on that, but as far as where does this coaching stand, or coaching search, I should say, where does it currently stand at this point in time?
Yeah, listen, I do think that we're probably going to get sort of a sense of I don't know, the beginning of the end here pretty soon in terms of, the process just played out very deliberately for a while. And there have been times when I think there's kind of been criticism of some reporting around it in all corners because of the lack of information, when I think in some cases that information just hasn't existed in that particular moment. I think what's been happening, in fact, I'm confident in saying what's been happening for the last couple weeks is Turnkey, the search firm that Indiana engaged just the way they did with Kurt Signetti, has been kind of doing a lot of due diligence, background, making contact with agents, looking at coaches' sort of backgrounds and things. Probably doing more, for example, on a Ben McCollum or a Jared Calhoun, mid-major guys that probably haven't kind of been in the spotlight quite as much compared to, I don't know, somebody like Greg McDermott, who everybody kind of knows who Greg McDermott is, what he is as a coach. I think you are probably, and I don't think it's going to happen publicly. I mean, the thing I can say most confidently about the search is that Scott Dolson, from what I have heard, has not let anybody in other than the absolute sort of, need to know people. I mean, there are people within the IE sphere that have been denied any sort of information that surprised me, if that makes sense. Either that or they know and they're flat out lying for misdirection, which is in itself, frankly, kind of an impressive card trick to pull during a coaching search to get people to just go actively lie on your behalf. I do think we're kind of entering that stage where it's probably going to start clarifying a little bit more, if for no reason other than because the candidates that Indiana is going to want to consider most heavily are about to finish their seasons at some point in the next, 3 to 4 weeks, probably more likely 2 to 3 weeks. I know there have been, you mentioned what Jeff reported, and I have no reason to sort of dispute Jeff's sources. It seems like some of the high major candidates, when I say have distanced themselves from the job, like there are some candidates in there, like Scott Drew, for example, where I'd be surprised if Indiana didn't at least, initiate a conversation, maybe through a search firm, but I'm not sure that Scott Drew was ever as serious of a candidate as what he was taken to be in some circles. Now, listen, if Scott Drew's Indiana's head coach in 3 weeks, then I'll hold up my hands and say, I got that one wrong. And the other thing too is in a coaching search, stuff can change. Somebody can change their mind overnight, and all of a sudden something that was an absolute non-starter yesterday is something worth exploring today, and then is something completely fully formed and executed tomorrow. So there's, the difficulty in covering coaching searches is sorting through all the noise to find the facts. The convenience of covering coaching searches is you can always just blame the noise on getting something wrong. I do wonder at what point we start to see Indiana maybe more firmly engaged with some mid-major options. And I put together a list of 6 guys that we have on IndyStar.com today. Not necessarily like coaches. I think Indiana will look at every one of them, but more kind of the idea of if Indiana went down to that level, if Indiana was looking for another Kurt Signetti type hire, a coach who just needed that opportunity at the highest level to prove, just how good they are, who would be the obvious candidates from the sort of mid-major level. And I've gotten some, I think fairly predictable reaction of people saying that would be disappointing. And I get that. And listen, Indiana went down that road with Archie Miller and it didn't work out. So I would understand anybody who'd retain a certain measure of skepticism in that sort of instance. But I also link back to something I wrote last year when Kentucky hired Mark Pope, and I just kind of pointed out, jobs like these don't tend to hire obvious home runs. The big outliers historically, at least in recent history, are Bill Self going from Illinois to Kansas and John Calipari going from Memphis to Kentucky. Other than that, if you think about Bob Knight and Mike Krzyzewski were both hired out of Army. North Carolina hasn't hired outside the family since Frank McGuire. When Roy Williams was hired at Kansas, he was hired off of Dean Smith's staff as an assistant. Matt Painter did 1 year at Southern Illinois before coming back to be coach in waiting at Purdue to replace Gene Keady, who was hired from Western Kentucky. Judd Heathcote was hired, I think, from Montana, either Montana or Montana State. It's escaping me all of a sudden. And, of course, famously, he's replaced by Tom Izzo. Bo Ryan. If you want to look at other Big Ten schools, Bo Ryan was firmly a sort of, I think, a Division II or Division III and then mid-major coach before he was hired at Wisconsin. Thad Matta is hired from Xavier, but remember, Xavier's not the same program then that it is now. It's not in the Big East, or if it was newly in the Big East at that point. If you even want to look like very recently, last year, Louisville, Kentucky, and Michigan, all programs that in some way are meaningful peers to Indiana, either because of their conference affiliation or because of their history. Louisville, Kentucky, and Michigan hire from Charleston, BYU, and Florida Atlantic. So it just, like, history tells us that sort of hire is more common than going for someone who's already proven at what we net with, at least in modern terms, we would call the high major level, and having them just kind of step up and step in, sort of seamlessly. That is much more common. And I'm not necessarily prepared to predict that's what Indiana is going to do. Again, I don't have a fully formed idea of where Indiana is going in this yet. I'm not sure anyone does outside of the inner circle that Scott Dolson is clearly keeping tight. But it wouldn't shock me if Indiana goes that way, purely because history tells me that is the likeliest outcome, maybe by some distance.
Zach, I appreciate your time as always, and I appreciate your insight. We'll definitely catch up here again in a few weeks, probably once this whole thing is sorted out. And until then, we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Again, a big thanks to Zach Osterman. Really appreciate having somebody like him come on and share his thoughts. I know he's one of the more trusted sources, or just really voices, beat writers, whatever you want to refer to him as, when it comes to Indiana University athletics as a whole, basketball, football, the whole shebang. So very happy to have him on the show, and we'll definitely check in with him once again, once the head coaching search is all said and done, unless it just becomes a lot lengthier of a process than maybe people imagined it being. But if Indiana doesn't have their head coach by the time said candidates and put the S in, parenthesis, by the time whoever the targeted candidate falls out of the NCAA tournament, I guess basically if you get to the end and all the guys you've talked about from, mid-major level to the high major level, whatever it may be, once those are all gone, if Indiana hasn't made their announcement by then, there would be reason for concern and questioning, I feel like, at that point. I don't know if panic would be the right word. I guess we'll have to wait and see how things really feel when we get to that point, but I don't necessarily anticipate it being like that. But it's very interesting that Zach Osterman, he's kind of echoing what Mike DeCourcy kind of began, that sort of framing of things nearly a month ago at this point, whenever we talked about the coaching search with him, and he had mentioned, the likelihood of getting a big name guy or a name from a big time school, and how unlikely it is to have that sort of be the case. And if everything that has been reported is true, about Scott Drew shutting it down, TJ Otzelberger, whoever it could be, I know Mick Cronin hasn't really been shot down unless I've missed something. But whenever you get rid of those and you start thinking mid-majors, I think unless, and again, fans, we have our preference of things, and we're honestly, all of us are so different. We're not all ever going to be on the same page if it's truly up to the fans, right? A majority might be 51%, and that's a basic majority. That's still a divided fan base. And so, especially when you look at mid-major candidates, you can really get opinions from all over the place. And even when you look at somebody like a Ben McCollum, even though he's somebody that I've sort of championed as somebody that I would like to see potentially coaching the sidelines at Indiana, I definitely understand why there would be pushback, especially, we've talked about this a bunch, the Archie Miller comparisons. And I'm sitting here looking at just kind of Drake's sort of resume this year in general and what they kind of look like. And so Right now, they're 29 and, or excuse me, 30-3. They've punched their ticket to the NCAA tournament by winning the Missouri Valley. Their 3 losses came. We've talked a little bit about this before. They lost to UIC by 4, 74-70. They lost to Murray State 66-59, and then their most recent loss was against Bradley 61-59. And we've already mentioned before the slow pace that Ben McCollum's teams play. His current team currently scores 70.1 or averages. They average 70.1 points per game, and that is good for 302nd in the country. And I don't have the entire list of teams in front of me, but I'd be willing to think that they're probably the only team in that 300 level that will make the NCAA tournament. The only other, types of teams that I would maybe expect to get in there are some of the bid stealers from, the low majors. And they're not even really bid stealers. It's more so the conferences that, like the SWAC, that sort of thing. Those conferences that are one bid leagues where, even a team that is really bad can just get hot on a run and win their league because the league in general isn't very good. That may be the only other type of team that scores in the 300s when it comes to the ranking for their offense. And then looking at a couple of other things, rebounds per game, 31, 407. That's tied. I mean, I didn't even know there were 400 teams in the Division I level at this point, but I guess you've had a lot of teams jump up to Division I in the last several years. And then assists per game, 13.3, tied for 233rd. Long story short is this team doesn't score it's not they don't score a lot. I think they're fairly efficient, or else they wouldn't be winning as many games as they are. But of course, we all just know that this is very reminiscent of how Archie Miller ran things. But what's the difference here? I think what most fans will want to know is if Indiana moved forward with someone like a Ben McCollum, what will be different this time around? And I'm not even just talking about, the way that they handle the media and that sort of thing behind a microphone. That stuff's important. But what will make the product work this time around? And we all know things are different because, back when Archie Miller was at Indiana, you couldn't build a team as easily with NIL and all that sort of stuff because he didn't have that whenever he was head coach. You had to do everything in the traditional sense where if Ben McCollum or whoever's here at Indiana at that point, whoever's here, they can use the resources of NIL, the transfer portal, and build their team based on the style in order for it to work as best as it can. You saw Mike Woodson try to do that. And I hate to say that he failed because he didn't fail, but nothing lived up to the expectation that there was coming into the season. Not everything connected. And that's going to be whoever ends up being the head coach. That's going to be one of his primary jobs, especially during his first season, is to establish an identity and culture that will mesh so well together that no matter what the style of play is, it's able to work because it's what you're getting things done the way you wanted to. And I think one of the best examples of that right now is Pat Kelsey with Louisville. They play very much the opposite of what someone like Ben McCollum would do. They're high flying. They play fast. They shoot a whole bunch of 3-pointers. But it can be a little bit reckless at times. But he's put together a roster at U of L that's helped them get second place in the ACC. They only lost 2, maybe 3 games in conference play. And it's because he was able to find guys that fit what he wanted to do. And, we've said this before, but you got to chalk up some of the success that they had to the ACC not being as difficult. But when many people were expecting Louisville to be kind of middle to maybe even some like the lower tier of the conference, and instead you're second place, and it really wasn't even close, that's a whole nother ball game. I mean, again, I know we compare everything to Kurt Signetti, or at least I do, I feel like, but when Indiana was picked second to last or last in some cases in football, and then they end up making the college football playoff, going 11-1, only losing one conference game, no matter what the schedule was like that's unprecedented on numerous levels. Now, Louisville basketball is different than Indiana football. Louisville basketball, one of the perennial powers, where Indiana had never experienced anything like, well, I say anything. You do have the Rose Bowl team. I do have to mention that. But the modern era of football, Indiana has never experienced anything like that. So it's not the exact same thing, but it's more so parallel in the level of turnaround that took place because of how horrible Louisville was during their 2 seasons under Kenny Payne. And I think part of me feels like I'm sounding like a broken record at this point because I've mentioned maybe I haven't mentioned that as much as I think I do, but maybe I have. Who knows? I'm just around it all of the time here, living in Louisville, and so maybe I just feel like I mention it more often than I do. But we'll keep an eye on it. I'm definitely going to be watching Drake very closely in the NCAA tournament, and it would be very. I don't know that I'm rooting for this, but man, it would be very weird to see Indiana get into the tournament and play somebody like Drake, and because you'd want them to win, but you're also like, okay, is this somebody who's going to be our head coach? If so, I mean, I know we want Indiana to win right now. We want Woodson to go out on as high of a note as possible, but we also want the future head coach. We want him to look good, right? And so you don't want to lose to the current head coach. And again, I know we've talked about that a little bit before, but it'll be very interesting to see how many potential candidates Indiana might run into if they do indeed make the NCAA tournament as they are currently projected. So we'll put that conversation to bed here, and then I do want to take one more look at bracketology before we wrap things up here. I know this is kind of a shorter episode than what we normally do, closer to an hour, but the time crunch of the day and getting things in order to have this episode ready for the morning. Sometimes things just don't equate out to the typical time and fashion, whatever you want to call it. I feel like I'm trying to use big words and I don't need to. But let's take a look in case anyone hasn't seen. Lunardi currently has Indiana in his last 4 in. I believe that was the case on Monday when we checked. But the positioning, at least the way the bracket looks, I should say, that has changed since we last spoke. Of course, Indiana's still an 11 seed. He has them playing Oklahoma in the play-in game. If they win, they would still be in the Providence region. But as a 6 seed, for facing the 6 seed Kansas, no longer Louisville. Louisville's gotten bumped down to a 7 seed for some reason. I don't know why that is. Maybe somebody secured a bid from a low major or a mid major that bumped some teams down a seed line or something like that. Because the Providence region, for the most part, is the same. St. John's being a 3, but I do see UNC Wilmington in place of what was formerly Towson. And I don't see Towson in here anymore. I don't think that is any sort of bid stealing scenario. I believe that's a 1-bid league that they're a part of. But either way, my dream scenario of getting Indiana versus Louisville in an opening round game, at least not likely in this, if this were to be the edition. We can't take Joe Lunardi's bracket as gospel because, it's more than likely not even going to come close to that. So also I've noticed now that the sun has gone down, the lighting effect in the room is a little bit different than when we started doing this here. But with that being said, I guess to wrap things up here, with Indiana being in the last 4 in, and I'm sure it differs depending on which bracket you're looking at right now. I know we're not doing a whole in-depth thing with a bunch of brackets at the moment, but you heard Zach say this, and I'm kind of along the same lines of thinking as him right now. Indiana can solidify their NCAA tournament chance or appearance, whatever you want to call it. They can solidify that with a win on Thursday against Oregon. If they lose, I think they have a very strong argument to remain in. Being, the lack of quad 2, 3, and 4 losses, as Zach mentioned, not necessarily a lot of quad 1 wins, but when those are your only losses as well, that bodes well compared to a lot of other resumes. So they'll probably have to sweat it out a whole lot more than you would want them to. And if they also lose, you'll have to be paying attention to some of the leagues that may or may not have bid stealers, and that will likely end up really deciding Indiana's fate in the long run. So best case scenario, they win on Thursday. Even better case scenario, they defeat Michigan State on Friday and just keep on trucking. And, I'm not saying they need the auto bid, but the further you get, you can maybe bump yourself up a couple of seed lines. But like we talked about with Kyler earlier in the week, do you really want to get all the way up to a 9 and have to potentially play a 1 seed in the second round? I mean, not necessarily. It would be fun to knock off one of those teams, but you normally like to wait a little bit longer in the tournament before you face off against one of those elite level teams. So we'll go ahead and wrap up today's show right there. Tomorrow, Kyler and I will, and so I don't really know how it's going to work out. We are going to do post-game wrap-up shows for the Big Ten tournament. Thankfully, with Indiana's pathway, likely having, not even likely, their first 2 games, if they play in both of them, will both be at noon. I mean, and that works out wonderfully for me with my schedule. And so as long as I'm able to connect up with Kyler or one of those who are in Indianapolis for the tournament, then we will definitely have post-game wrap-up shows for the first couple of rounds, and likely if they keep winning moving forward as well. So, and then Friday's show could be a little weird depending on how Indiana is doing in the tournament. So that's what to expect moving forward later into the week. But until then, this has been, and I guess I'm kind of prematurely wrapping things up. Be sure to subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated real quick if you have not done so already. Not just for me, but over the course of the next couple of weeks as Indiana goes through the postseason. Be sure to hit that notifications bell so you get notified of anything that gets uploaded, so that you can check it out right away and stay up to date on everything that's happening with the Hoosiers during their postseason run. So now we're going to wrap it up here. Until then, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.